Welcome back to Serger Tip Clips. French seams are a beautiful couture technique for sheer fabrics, and today I'd like to show you an updated version of them, Serger French seams, and I want to tell you a little story. One of my favorite all-time movies is from 1940, and it's The Philadelphia Story. It starred Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, and one of my favorite all-time actresses, Katharine Hepburn. I live in a suburb outside of Hartford, Connecticut, and Katharine Hepburn was a Hartford native. And a couple of years ago, a local historical society had an exhibit of some of her costumes from various plays and movies, but they also had some of her everyday clothes as well. And it was really, really fun to see it because several of the costumes on exhibit were from the Philadelphia Story. And one of them was a beautiful pink silk organza gown that she wore in some of the scenes. And when I had a chance to examine it up close, it had the tiniest French seams I have ever seen on anything. And it made me think that I had some pink silk organza in my stash, and it would be a perfect way to show it to you in this Serger tip clip. So let me get started and show you some of the steps. First, let's talk about how we construct a traditional French seam. Instead of right sides together, which we usually do for most construction, we start wrong sides together. You're going to check your pattern to see what the designated seam allowance is. And for this example, let's just say it's a 1/2 inch. So instead of stitching wrong sides together at that 1/2 inch mark, why don't we say we'd stitch about 1/4 inch from the raw edges. And then you're going to trim that seam allowance down to, maybe a fat 1/8 inch. Give the seam a press, and then you're going to press the seam allowance to one side. You don't have to press that seam allowance open. Then you're going to fold it over and encase that raw edge and the seam allowance in, and now your right sides together. You're going to give that, I find, a little bit of a press helps. And then if you need some pins in there, that's fine. And then go back to your sewing machine and stitch on that designated seam allowance of a 1/2 inch. Give it another press. Press the seam allowance to one side, and you've got a very beautiful traditional French seam. Now let's talk about the updated Serger French seam. Unlike the traditional one where we start with the fabric wrong sides together, this time we're going to stitch at the sewing machine first with the fabric right sides together the way we usually do. And again, you're going to check your pattern. This time for the example, I'm going to stitch on the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I have my sewing machine set on a short stitch because silk organza is very lightweight. I used a 2.0 stitch length. I just went down, stitched the seam, and gave it a light press. Now, the next step is optional, but I find it very helpful to draw in a line for where I want to trim away the fabric with the cutting blade on my serger, and I'm going to show you that next. And we'll do the rolled hem on the serger. Just a couple of things I want to show you before we start stitching. You can see that the line I drew is a fat 1/8 inch away from the stitching line, and I've got my knife aligned with that. I haven't begun stitching yet, but the other thing I want to mention is that sometimes when you're doing a rolled hem stitch, the serger chain tends to form a little bit of a pigtail and it curls around itself, and as you begin stitching, sometimes that tail of the serger chain can get hung up in the stitching on the edge of the fabric. The easiest fix for that is just hang on to it and keep it out of your way. So let's start stitching along, and I'm going to take my time. I've got my machine set up for a 3-thread rolled hem. I've got a very pretty light pink thread in my upper looper, which is the one that shows the most. And I chose actually a very pretty embroidery thread because it's very lightweight. I have my stitch length on about 1.5, and my differential feed is on, and because I'm going through a double layer, even though it's a lightweight fabric, it's a double layer. So let's stitch and see how we do. I'm just taking my time, letting that knife trim right along the line that I've drawn on it. And once I start stitching along and I'm past the beginning of the fabric, I don't have to worry about that thread chain anymore in back of the foot. Taking your time and giving yourself a very uniform seam allowance will make it look very, very pretty, because it is visible from the right side when the garment is worn. Let me just give myself a little bit of a snip. And there you have a beautiful, very tiny serger French seam, but you've got your sewing machine stitching also to reinforce that seam. So I'm going to give that a press and we'll take a look at the finished product. I'm going to clip off this little pigtail at the beginning. All right, we're all stitched up. I trimmed off my thread tail. I left a little bit of one over here, but I'm just giving it a very light press with some steam. And this is a very teeny tiny little French seam, but again, that sewing machine stitching line is right next to it. I don't think the camera will pick it up, but you can see this is from the right side. I think that's pretty beautiful. So enjoy, and there's no trimming away. Your serger is doing that for you with the cutting blade. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again soon.